Hi guys, welcome to Module 3. This week I want to go over our Milestone 1 guidelines and what this assignment is about. This is going to be the first step toward your final project. And your final project is going to be really a series of milestones that you're going to be working on for this term, polishing it up, tweaking things based on my recommendations, and submitting a final product to me. So this is important that you do well on this, you understand the objectives. I would also recommend that, time permitting, you please take a look at the final grading rubric so you can see how it all comes together. What I would suggest and recommend is that you use these rubrics as your outline as you prepare your paper. You can keep a separate, for example, a separate desk copy, and then as you go along, you can tweak it, you can polish it up, so that when the final paper is due, you don't have a whole lot to do, because if you've been keeping up with the assignments and making the tweaks and polishing it up, then by the time it's ready to submit, your work is going to be limited. If you don't do that, then you're going to be cramming at the last minute, cutting and pasting and trying to put things together and have it make sense, and it may not make as much sense. Okay, so again, use the grading rubric as an outline, and I think that will help you out. So let's go over this grading rubric so you have an idea as to what it is that we'll be looking for. So the first part of the assignment is judicial system hierarchical structure, and we've talked about this. We've talked about the federal structure, you've looked at your state structure, and so you have an idea as to how the courts operate. Basically, we're looking at a three-tiered system for the most part. We have trial courts, appellate courts, Supreme Courts, but some states might have misdemeanor courts, we'll just call them misdemeanor courts, or low-level courts that are used to handle stuff such as traffic citations, minor other type of infractions, or low-level type of misdemeanors. All right, so how you want to classify that is really going to be up to you, but try to keep it as a 3 or 4 tiered system as you make your distinction between the federal system and the state system. All right, and the primary role of each. You've talked about this at the federal level, so you can apply some of those same concepts to the state level, other than the fact that in the state level you might have that lower court who deals with low-level misdemeanors and things like that, okay? Ultimately, the big picture is that if you have an efficient and effective judicial system, then these courts each serve a unique role that allows the system to maintain that sense of efficiency and effectiveness. Now, one of the key things I want to spend just a minute talking about here under the hierarchical structure, because you're going to be talking about the roles. You guys did well on this in identifying the roles for the district court. Remember, the district court is, in fact, the workhorse of the federal system. And the state level is pretty similar. The trial courts, again, are the workhorse of the system. But in the state level, we have other ancillary courts that we use to help take the burden off some of the other courts. So we have juvenile courts, you might have probate courts, things like that, those specialty courts that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But one of the key things I want you to understand in terms of roles is for the appellate courts. For your appellate court and your Supreme Court, whether it's state or the United States Supreme Court. And I think the key for any appellate court, and this includes, again, your regular appellate court and the Supreme Court, is to maintain judicial consistency by providing guidance in the interpretation of federal law and the U.S. Constitution. And I think that's critical. Part of what these courts do is provide guidance to the lower courts. They correct errors that the lower courts have made and provide them with additional guidance. If the U.S. Supreme Court and if, for example, the Circuit Court of Appeals are doing a very efficient and effective job, then the level of significant appeals should be reduced, because those problems shouldn't arise as frequently because the lower courts now have clear guidelines and instruction. You will need to maintain judicial consistency. And I think that's one of the more critical roles of the criminal justice system, is to maintain that consistency and fairness, all right? So that's a key component to me for these judicial systems, especially at the appellate and Supreme Court level. Also, the appellate and the Supreme Court play a role in terms of policymaker. Over the last 30, 40 years, the United States Supreme Court has done more in terms of changing public policy than any other government institution. They've looked at and evaluated racial integration, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, immigration, police use of force, police interrogation tactics. All of these things are significant public policy issues that the courts have addressed. So that's also one of the key functions of the appellate courts and the United States Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts. They pretty much did the same thing except at the state level. Okay. Next is judicial systems level. Explains the primary differences between federal and state judicial systems and describes the importance of having levels. This is going to go back again to understanding what takes place at each of these levels. So when you're looking at the differences of federal and state judicial systems, the key difference is federal courts regulate and control federal law. State courts regulate and control state law. So that is a key distinction. So in other words, I cannot be prosecuted in federal court for committing a state crime, because in order for the federal courts to charge me with a crime, it has to be for a federal statute. It's called the United States Code. Whereas if I commit a state crime, I can't be charged federally. Let's say I commit a burglary in California. I'm charged with California Penal Code Section 459. I can't be tried in federal court because they lack the jurisdiction. So the key differences so far is that each enforces the appropriate laws of which they are governed. Federal law is enforced under the federal court system. State laws are enforced under the state court system. And then the importance of having the different levels of each of these. All right, one's a trial court, one's the appellate court, and one is basically the final decision maker. Okay, the state Supreme Courts, for the most part, and the United States Supreme Court on all cases, is the final arbiter of any legal dispute. All right, so those are some of the key differences and similarities between them. So you're going to have to maybe do a little bit more research on your own, but that's sort of what we're looking for there. The next question on subject matter jurisdiction explains the subject matter jurisdiction for federal, state, and local courts and states its impact on efficiency. So you guys addressed some of this when you talked about district courts. All right, so you talked about immigration courts, we talked about patent courts, we talked about bankruptcy courts. All right, each of these are unique to, in this case, we'll talk about the federal level. And they play a specific role in terms of their efficiency of the overall operation, because these are specialty areas of the law. Not that criminal law is a specialty, but these are uniquely different. All right. The only thing about criminal law that separates it from civil law is that criminal law deals with people's rights in terms of, you got a guy sitting in jail, you just can't keep people in jail. Whereas civil law, we're not talking about somebody sitting in jail. We're not talking about their rights being violated. So one of the key things that we have to make sure we do is that those criminal courts have enough time to process criminal cases so that defendants can get a legal trial within a reasonable amount of time as authorized by the Constitution and the interpretation of the Constitution by federal courts. All right, so when we're looking at, again, some of these differences, we're talking about subject matter jurisdiction. So those things add a certain level of efficiency and effectiveness. Now, at the state level, we have traffic courts, we have drug courts, we have probate courts, some areas that have a lot of housing projects might have housing courts. So all of these take the burden off the criminal courts to allow them to deal with these low-level type offenses in an efficient and effective manner. And that allows the trial courts to spend a significant amount of their time working on criminal cases such as the felony cases, homicides, burglaries, assaults, those type of things. Okay, so take a look at that. Next is jurisdiction. Distinguishes which court would have jurisdiction and defends the response. So again, state courts enforce state law, so they would have jurisdiction. Federal courts enforce federal law, they would have jurisdiction. Jurisdiction again is tied to who is going to prosecute the case and who has the legal authority to hear the charges and go through the judicial process. So again, if I commit a state crime, I can't go to federal court, and if I commit a federal crime, I can't be tried in state court. It's just not going to happen. They have to have jurisdiction. All right, jurisdiction, and I've talked about this before in the handout or in one of my announcements, so you can take a look at those distinctions there. All right, but again, it's going to boil down to the type of law that has been violated, and whether it's federal law or state law. All right. So when you talk about jurisdiction, for example, I have a good example. This occurred some years ago. It was in a newspaper article. There was a police chief somewhere in Vermont that was getting frustrated with the lack of enforcement for immigration laws by the federal government, and so he basically resorted to having his officers arrest illegal immigrants if they came upon them as part of their job, a traffic stop, a domestic call, or something like that, and gave his officers instructions to arrest them for trespassing. I'm assuming trespassing in the United States or in his community because they're there illegally. You can give the guy an E for effort, but that's not going to happen because, again, the police chief does not have jurisdiction on immigration. The federal government has enforcement abilities on immigration. So for him to arrest illegal immigrants for immigration was illegal because he did not have jurisdiction. So you have to have jurisdiction in order to apply to law. And state law does not apply because the underlying charge or the reason for the arrest was they were here illegally, and that's a federal violation. Okay. Next is venue. We talked about venue. Determine how venue is established and describe the implications of venue. So venue, again, is the location, right? We talked about location. So the scenario you have is a bank robbery that occurs in Washington, D.C. Okay, so for our purposes of our little assignment here, the jurisdiction is going to be federal. Okay, we're going to treat the bank robbery as a federal crime, although most states have robbery statutes, and so we can go either way. But for our case, it's going to be a federal crime. So determine how venue is established. Well, venue is going to be established based on where the crime occurred or where elements of the crime were begun. So whether it's a conspiracy or something like that. Okay. In this particular case, when you look at venue, some of the complications could be, in our case, witnesses. We have witnesses that are in another state. Police officers stop and arrest these guys for another crime, which leads them to the robbery. You know, they find a gun, they find some money, and they make a connection between that and the robbery. So the implications for venue are when you're dealing with out-of-state witnesses, you're dealing with out-of-state agencies. So that can complicate things in terms of venue when you're talking about multiple agencies or more than one offense that has to be resolved. Okay, those are going to be boiled down to issues of venue, but generally venue is going to go to where the more serious crime occurred. And in this case, we talked about bank robbery. Venue is going to be Washington, D.C. Identify as venue for the scenario and defends why venue is most appropriate. So if the crime occurred in Washington, D.C. and it's a federal crime, it'll be heard in district court in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to show you a quick slide here in just a minute, but I need to get back to something real quick. I only have, looks like another minute and a half. So let me spend a little more time here on venue. Identify as venue for the scenario and defends why it is most appropriate. So again, it is a federal crime. We're going to treat this as a federal crime, okay? Remember, this is going to be a federal crime, so federal courts will have jurisdiction on this particular case, all right? So why is venue most appropriate? Because that's where the crime occurred. It has nothing to do with where the suspects live or anything else. It boils down to where the offense occurred, all right? So let me just show you here on another screen here. If I can get to it, hold on. My computer's acting up. Here we go. So this is an overview of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Okay? United States District Court for the District of Columbia. So when you write in your paper the location where this court is, who has venue, I would expect you to put the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. All right, so you can take a look at this website when you have time. It's actually a pretty good venue for you to take a look at, or link for you to take a look at, discusses the federal courts and so forth. All right, I think that was a good quick overview. Obviously, if you have any questions about this, you can email me, contact me anytime. All right, have a great week and do a really good job on this assignment for me. I appreciate it. Have a good day. Bye.